Have you ever stood at the edge of something wild, felt the freezing air sting your cheeks, and wondered if a single choice might change the course of a life? Maybe even your own. That's how it began for James Bennett, one lonely winter in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. Out here, winter was no postcard. The wind came slicing off the ridges, flinging pellets of ice against his old, creaking cabin. The woods around him stretching endless, dark, and raw. It was a world of silence, broken only by the crunch of snow under boots, or the distant cry of a hawk. James had come here hoping to lose himself, or maybe to find a quieter kind of pain, one not so sharp as the memory of hospital hallways and what he couldn't save. It was late January, a week after the last real snow, when he first spotted her. He was out with his camera just past dawn, hoping for footage of deer. That's when he saw the movement by the tree line. Not a deer, not a fox, but something leaner, rougher, haunting the edge of the clearing like a shadow. He steadied his lens and felt his heart thud. A bobcat. Female by her build and the wary, determined way she moved. Her fur looked patchy, ribs faintly visible, eyes too bright above a muzzle smeared with frost. James knew the rules. Don't interfere, don't feed the wild. But the rule book didn't cover the look in her eyes. He watched her prowl, nose to the ground, desperate, then saw her freeze and stare back. For a heartbeat, he felt the world pause. Two living creatures, both a little hungry for something, just watching each other breathe. He tried to walk away. He really did. All that day, he kept busy with chores, splitting firewood, tightening the shutters, boiling water for coffee. But she haunted him. Not just her gaunt body, but what it meant to be alone and hungry out here. He knew enough wildlife biology to understand. Feeding wild animals could kill them, could make them too bold, get them shot by a rancher or hit by a car. But he'd also spent 20 years as an ER nurse, trained to act in the face of suffering, even when it was messy, even when there weren't any good options. He remembered the faces of people who'd begged for help, remembered the guilt of walking away, when you could have maybe done something. That night, as sleet pinged against the windows, James paced the little cabin. He argued with himself, out loud at first, then in whispers. You're not her savior. You'll just make it worse. But in the dark, he kept seeing her face. Starving, stubborn, wild. He tried to sleep, but every groan of the wind sounded like a cry for help. At 2 a.m., he couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed a raw chicken breast from his freezer, wrapped it in a towel, and slipped outside, boots crunching through fresh snow. He didn't go far, just to the edge of the woods where he'd seen her, the spot where wild met tame. He set the chicken down gently, almost ashamed, and whispered, "If you're out there, this is all I've got." Then he crept back inside, feeling both relieved and guilty, like a man breaking a promise to himself. The next morning he checked the spot. The chicken was gone. No footprints, just a swath of disturbed snow and one tuft of bobcat fur snagged on a branch. He didn't know if it was the right thing, but it felt necessary. For the next 3 days, he watched from inside as the storm thickened. Sometimes he caught glimpses, a flash of spotted fur, yellow eyes glinting in the half-light. Each time she seemed a little less afraid, lingering near the trees. James started talking to her through the glass, his voice low and calm, like he would with a spooked patient. "You're tougher than I am out there. I know that." He began leaving food at dawn, always in the same spot, never closer. But each time the boundary between them blurred a little more, her trust growing, his caution wavering. He filmed her with his old camera, documenting every wary step. Some nights, He swore he saw a smaller shape moving behind her in the shadows. But when he played back the footage, there was only snow, wind, and a mother who refused to quit. He couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't just about the bobcat. It was about him, about not turning away from suffering, about the cost of compassion, even when you knew you might pay for it later. What did it mean, really, to earn the trust of something wild? Was it a gift or a burden? And if you crossed that invisible line, if you broke the rules, could you ever make things right again? As the days stretched on, James realized he was waiting for something. A sign, maybe, or just the next crisis. He didn't know if he'd saved the bobcat or doomed her to a new kind of dependence. But every morning, when he found her tracks in the snow, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe trust, once given, was its own kind of answer. Maybe you don't always get to know the cost. In the silence of that mountain winter, James made a quiet promise. If she needed him, he would be there. For better or worse, he'd crossed the line. The story, for both of them, was only just beginning. The storm arrived with a fury that seemed almost biblical. By nightfall, snow was falling in thick, swirling sheets, the wind howling like some ancient animal loose in the mountains. James had lived through plenty of bad weather since coming to the Blue Ridge, but this was different. The old-timers on the radio called it a 100-year blizzard, and for once they weren't exaggerating. The drifts piled higher than his porch railing, ice slicked every window, and the woods outside seemed to shrink, swallowed up by white and darkness, until the whole world was reduced to his tiny circle of warmth and light. He should have felt safe. Instead, James's mind kept spinning back to the bobcat. He hadn't seen her all day, and the food he'd left out was untouched, buried under half a foot of new snow. Every few hours, he checked the trail camera by the clearing, squinting at the tiny screen, desperate for any sign. What he found made his breath catch in his throat. The bobcat was not alone. The grainy footage showed a smaller, clumsier shape trailing her through the storm. A kitten, its head barely poking above the drifts, struggling to keep up. James's pulse hammered. This changed everything. It was one thing to watch over a grown animal, another to realize she had a life depending on her, too. The rules he'd tried to follow seemed less and less relevant with every minute the blizzard raged on. All he could do was watch the storm batter the glass, feeling useless, heart pounding as he remembered another winter, another life. A teenage boy pulled from a car wreck, his mother wailing in the snow as James's hands worked, desperate to find a pulse. He'd failed then. The memory still stung, a scar he'd never managed to numb. For 2 days the blizzard buried the mountain, cutting power lines and choking roads with snow. James rationed firewood, melted snow on the stove, and tried not to think about what was happening out there in the woods. Sometimes, in the night, he imagined he heard a yowl carried on the wind, or claws scraping at the siding. Maybe it was just his guilt playing tricks on him. He spent the long hours replaying the footage over and over. The mother's determined stride, the kitten's struggle, the slow, heartbreaking way wildness fought to survive. When the storm finally broke, the world outside was transformed. Everything was buried, dazzling and blue beneath a washed-out sky. James waded out to check the food spot, boots sinking deep, breath puffing in clouds. The woods were silent, blanketed in a kind of peace that felt both beautiful and cruel. He circled the clearing, searching for tracks. There were some, large oval prints he recognized as the bobcats, but he didn't see any kitten tracks, just the adult, looping in wide, frantic circles, then vanishing into the timber. Panic gnawed at his gut. Had the kitten been lost to the cold? Had his help come too late? His cautious compassion just another useless gesture in the face of nature's indifference? James clenched his fists, torn between heartbreak and helplessness. The old battle inside him flaring up, intervene or let go. This was why he'd left medicine behind. There were only so many losses a person could take before the weight broke you down to nothing. That night, he barely slept. He kept the porch light burning, checked the window every hour, listened for sounds that never came. The mountains seemed to hold their breath. At 5 a.m., just as the sky began to lighten, James was startled awake by a sharp, desperate scratching at his front door. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. Then he heard it again, high, frantic, scraping at the wood. He threw on his jacket, heart in his throat, and opened the door to a sight he would never forget. The bobcat was there, wilder and more ragged than ever, her yellow eyes wide and wild. She stood not 3 feet away, tense but unafraid. At her side, almost invisible in the shadow of her legs, was the kitten. The little one's fur was matted with ice. One paw held awkwardly off the ground, its tiny face scrunched in pain. For a second, time froze. James met the mother's gaze, unblinking, urgent, pleading in a way words never could. He felt a bolt of memory, a mother's face in the snow, hope and terror fused together. The old instinct roared up inside him. This time he wouldn't stand by and watch life slip away. He knelt slowly, hands open. The bobcat didn't run. She didn't growl or attack. She just stood there, shivering, watching every move. James gently scooped up the kitten. The little creature whimpered, but didn't fight. Its paw was bleeding, and it shivered violently against his chest. He backed away, speaking low and steady, promising, maybe to the animals, maybe to himself, that he'd do everything right. Inside, James laid the kitten on a blanket by the wood stove, heart pounding, hands steady from years of practice even as his mind raced. The mother bobcat stayed outside, pacing just beyond the window, never leaving her line of sight. For a long moment, they stared at each other, one man and a wild soul, joined by fear and hope and the thinnest thread of trust. He knew he was breaking every rule, crossing every line. But when he looked into the bobcat's eyes, seeing not just hunger, but the raw force of a mother's love, James understood. Sometimes, the risk isn't in acting, it's in turning away. This time he would not turn away. Whatever the price, the storm might be over, but for James, the true test was just beginning. The cabin felt too small for the weight of James's decision. He moved like a ghost, every motion careful and deliberate, as if one false step might shatter the fragile truce he'd made with the wild. The little bobcat kitten, Milo he found himself calling him, lay swaddled on a faded wool blanket near the wood stove, sides rising and falling in shallow, trembling breaths. Blood, dark and sticky, matted the fur around his paw. Each time the kitten whimpered, James flinched. The mother bobcat's shadow never left the window. Her eyes burned from the darkness, wild and unblinking, a silent accusation and a desperate plea at the same time. James's hands, once so confident in an emergency, trembled as he set out his supplies. He cleaned the wound with warm water, wincing at Milo's pitiful yowl, then wrapped the paw as best he could with gauze from his old first aid kit. He whispered, "Easy. I know it hurts, buddy. Hang in there." It wasn't lost on him how his voice shook, so much steadier when facing human pain. But this was something else. Here there was no protocol, no backup, no legal shield. Only the thin hope that what he did was right. As he worked, flashes of memory crashed through his mind. Cold ER rooms, blue-tinged lips, the reek of antiseptic and panic. He remembered the last time he'd tried, and failed. How the loss had eaten away at him day after day, until he'd packed up and come out here, telling everyone he needed peace but really running from the echo of his own regrets. Now, in this storm-racked cabin, the past collided with the present, old guilt tangled with new fear. Outside, the Bobcat mother never moved, her gaze fixed through the glass, as if she could will her kitten back to health just by watching. Every time James glanced up and saw her there, he felt her trust like a physical thing, heavy, precious, and terrifying. It would be easier if she'd just attacked or run away. But she stayed, silent and immovable, as if reminding him that the line between caring and interfering was razor thin. His medical instincts told him Milo needed more help than he could give. The kitten's leg was swelling, infection a constant threat. Finally, fighting back the panic, James reached for his phone and called the nearest wildlife rehabilitation center. The connection crackled, the line barely holding under the weight of the storm. A woman answered, voice brisk and professional. "Mountain Wildlife Rescue, this is Dr. Hayes." James explained the situation as quickly and calmly as he could, leaving out the part where he'd already broken every guideline about not interfering. "He's maybe 6 weeks old, paws badly cut, bleeding stopped. But I'm worried about infection. He's cold, lethargic." His voice cracked, and he tried to cover it. I just want to do the right thing." There was a long pause. Dr. Hayes spoke gently, as if sensing how close he was to the edge. "You did the right thing calling us. Keep him warm. Don't feed him anything but water for now. We'll walk you through what to do next. Just be prepared. With a wound that bad, sometimes they don't make it." James stared at Milo, then at the mother bobcat silhouetted by the window, and felt the old fear rise up. What if I fail again? What if, no matter how hard I try, it's not enough? He remembered promising the mother, through that cold pane of glass, that he wouldn't give up this time. The memory of that young patient lost in a snowstorm, the feeling of defeat, the agony of having hope snatched away at the last second, seared through him. He'd always told himself there would be a next time, a chance to get it right. Was this it? Was this the moment? He forced himself to focus on what he could do. He kept Milo warm, gently syringing water between his lips, checking the bandage for signs of fresh bleeding. Every few minutes, he caught himself speaking aloud, half to the kitten, half to the mother outside. "You're tough, little guy. I know you want to sleep, but you gotta fight." When exhaustion pressed in, he stood at the window, talking quietly to the mother bobcat, apologizing for his own limits, promising again and again, "I'll do everything I can." The hours crawled. He found himself studying the kitten's tiny face for changes. Was his breathing better or worse? Was that a flicker of life or just a twitch? He tried to keep his hopes in check, tried to remember the lesson he'd learned too many times in the ER. Compassion doesn't guarantee a happy ending. Still, he kept fighting for Milo and for himself. At one point, he let the wildlife center know he would attempt to drive the kitten in once the roads cleared. Until then, it was up to him. The responsibility felt crushing. He sat beside Milo as the fire burned down, watching the sunrise light up the ice on the windows, turning the world gold and blue. The mother bobcat blinked slowly, never leaving her post. Together, on opposite sides of the glass, man and wild creature waited, neither willing to give up. That night, as darkness fell and the wind returned, James whispered to the kitten, "I won't give up this time, I swear." It was a vow to himself and to the wild that he would hold on as long as Milo did. In the quiet, with the storm outside and the fire burning low, He realized that caring meant risk, and trust meant facing the pain of what you couldn't control. Still, he refused to look away, because sometimes the difference between hope and despair was simply not giving up. By sunrise, the snow had settled into a cold, glassy crust, and the mountains gleamed under the clear sky. The world outside James's cabin was both dazzling and treacherous, a landscape that could kill with its beauty. James moved quickly, nerves buzzing, his decision already made. The kitten, Milo, was alive, but fading. His breathing was thin, the injured paw swollen, and every so often a shudder of pain rippled through his tiny body. There was no more waiting. Milo needed help only a vet could give, and the nearest wildlife rehab center was over 3 hours away. James gathered his supplies with the precision of a man who'd packed trauma kits in a dozen crisis situations. He tucked Milo into a towel, then wrapped him again in his thickest scarf, gently cradling the bundle inside his down jacket. Every motion was deliberate, every touch careful, a silent promise that he'd carry the kitten through whatever lay ahead. As he loaded the car, James looked back at the edge of the woods. The mother bobcat was there, her body pressed low, eyes following his every move. He paused, meeting her gaze across the cold divide. "I'm coming back," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure for whose benefit. Her ears flicked. She didn't run, only watched with a silent intensity that cut deeper than any words. The drive was a slow-motion nightmare. The storm had left the mountain roads coated in black ice, and the plows hadn't come close to the back roads. James's hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. Every curve threatened to spin the car into a ravine. Every hill was a battle of patience and luck. He kept the heater high, one hand occasionally slipping down to check Milo's warmth under the scarf. The kitten barely stirred. James whispered to him throughout the drive, voice steady, refusing to let the creeping fear take over. "Hang in there, buddy. We're almost there. I'm not letting go." The miles passed in a blur of ice, pine trees, and tense silence. When the panic started to rise, James found himself remembering his father, the gruff, stubborn hunter who'd raised him on these mountains. "Let wild things be," his father used to say, always with a finality that brooked no argument. As a boy, James had listened, but part of him had always wondered about the difference between respect and abandonment. Now, with Milo's frail body pressed to his chest, that old lesson felt heavier than ever. Was he saving a life, or was he robbing it of something essential? Where did compassion end and interference begin? He thought about his mother, too, who'd insisted that caring was never wasted, even when it didn't end the way you hoped. The memory stung in a different way. The hope and the heartbreak, tangled together like roots in the frozen ground. As the sun climbed, the car finally lurched onto the last stretch of plowed road, battered and caked with salt. James felt a surge of relief and guilt all at once. He was almost there, but he couldn't shake the sense that he was carrying more than just a wounded animal. He was carrying every failure and hope he'd ever known. He pulled into the rehab center's gravel lot just as his nerves began to fray. The staff met him at the door, brisk but gentle, whisking Milo into a bright clinical room. Dr. Hayes, the voice from the phone, was even-keeled and confident as she examined the kitten, her hands moving with the same practiced care James remembered from his own days in medicine. She glanced up at him, reading the tension on his face. "You did good, James. He's got a shot." But the news was complicated. The wound was deep, infected. Milo was dangerously weak. Dr. Hayes explained that wild-born kittens rarely survived injuries like this. not without extensive human intervention. Even if they saved his leg, there was a risk he'd imprint on people, losing the wariness that kept bobcats alive in the wild. James stood by the exam table, fists clenched at his sides, watching as they worked. He couldn't shake the image of the mother bobcat waiting at the edge of his land, her faith, her hope, all pinned on the human stranger who had crossed an invisible line. He felt the old ache, that familiar pain of wanting to do everything right and knowing you couldn't. The vet team moved efficiently, cleaning the wound, starting fluids, setting a tiny splint on Milo's paw. At one point, Milo's eyes fluttered open, and he gave a weak, questioning chirp. James bent low, whispering, "You're a fighter, kid. Keep going." It was as much for himself as for Milo. Dr. Hayes laid out the facts. If he makes it, we'll have to monitor closely. Rehab won't be easy. He might never be able to go back. But we owe him a chance. As James left the clinic to drive back to his cabin, the relief of handing Milo off was quickly replaced by a strange emptiness. The drive home was quieter, emptier. The mountains looked the same, but James felt changed, haunted by every choice, every risk, every uncertain outcome. He pulled up to the cabin in the gray afternoon, exhausted. The snow around his porch was covered in fresh tracks. The mother bobcat had waited, coming and going, searching for her lost kitten. James stepped outside and sat on the cold step, eyes stinging with cold and regret. "I did what I could," he murmured, hoping she was near enough to hear. Night fell and the stars came out, sharp and cold as glass. James watched the tree line, every shadow a question he couldn't answer. The woods had given him a test, and he had chosen to act. Now all he could do was wait, and hope that trust, once given, could survive the distance between worlds. The days that followed blurred together in a quiet battle of hope and worry. James found himself living between two worlds, one foot in the wild that had drawn him to the Blue Ridge, the other in the sterile, humming halls of the Wildlife Rehab Center. Each morning he woke early, the mountain dawn shining weakly through frosted windows, his first thought always of Milo. The absence in his cabin was palpable, a silence where kitten breaths and tentative soft mews had been. But James knew the work had only begun. He drove the winding road to the center almost every day, carrying with him bags of supplies and the raw ache of responsibility. The rehab staff kept him updated. Milo was holding on, but his recovery was uncertain. He was tiny for his age, the infection in his paw still fighting back despite antibiotics and careful cleaning. James spent hours beside Milo's enclosure, sitting quietly while the kitten drowsed, sometimes stirring to nuzzle a stuffed animal for comfort. When Milo opened his eyes, they were bright and unblinking, wild, but with a new softness, a searching quality that made James's chest tighten. Yet the mother bobcat haunted him just as much. Each night, when he returned to the cabin, he'd check the tree line and, almost without fail, spot her sleek shape moving through the shadows. She never came close, but she lingered, sometimes pausing on the ridge, sometimes circling the spot where she'd last seen her kitten disappear. There was a rhythm to it now, as if she were keeping vigil, refusing to leave until she knew Milo's fate. James left scraps of food at the edge of the woods, but the food was rarely touched. The mother seemed sustained only by hope and memory. One night, while James sat at his window watching the snowfall, the phone rang. It was Dr. Hayes from the rehab center. Her voice was steady but laced with caution. "James, you should know, we're getting a lot of attention on this case. The local news heard about Milo, and now there's reporters calling every day. Some folks are calling you a hero. Others, well, some aren't so happy. James frowned, rubbing the tension from his neck. Let me guess. People saying I should have left things alone? Exactly. There's debate about what it means to intervene, especially with wild animals. Some wildlife advocates are worried Milo won't ever go back to the wild. Others think we're setting a dangerous precedent. State officials might review our process. James swallowed, remembering the rules he'd broken. I just wanted to help, that's all. I know you did, Dr. Hayes said gently. But these are the questions that come with crossing the line. We're doing genetic tests. Milo's markings are unusual. If he's from a rare bloodline, that could change everything. James felt the pressure mounting, a familiar sensation from his years as a nurse, when every choice was watched, every outcome second-guessed by people who'd never held a life in their hands. Now, the difference was that the life in question had fur, fangs, and a legacy nobody fully understood. At the rehab center, debate raged quietly among the staff, too. One young biologist argued, if Milo survives and can't go back, have we helped him or doomed him to a cage? Another said, he could help the species. His genes might be vital for local bobcats. The conversation left James feeling unmoored, as if he were watching a storm from the center of the room, unable to change its course. But there were bright moments, too. On the fourth day, Milo finally ate a full meal and played with a feather toy, batting it with his good paw. The staff cheered softly. James felt hope bloom in his chest. Fragile but real, some little victory. An hour without fever, a purr that trembled in the air, felt like a miracle. Meanwhile, the world outside noticed. A local news team arrived, wanting an interview. James stood in front of the cabin, camera lights harsh against the snow, and tried to explain what he'd done and why. Sometimes, you just can't look away, he said. I know I broke the rules, but I couldn't let him die. Maybe the world needs more people willing to care, even when it's risky. The story spread online. Messages poured in, some supportive, others scathing. A few accused him of playing God, of kidnapping a wild animal. Others thanked him, saying he'd inspired them to care more deeply for the wild things on the edge of their lives. James read each note, letting both the praise and the criticism wash over him like cold water. He realized that every act of compassion drew a line in the snow, a border between the safe, comfortable world and the messy, uncertain wild. Once you crossed that line, there was no way back. At the end of each day, James would return to his cabin and find the mother bobcat's tracks circling in the snow. Some nights, he'd see her eyes reflecting green in the moonlight, unwavering, unafraid. He'd speak softly to her through the darkness, promising, I'm doing everything I can. There were no easy answers, no perfect choices, only the truth that every act of care, no matter how small, could change a life, for better or worse. And for James, the hardest lesson was realizing that sometimes saving something meant accepting consequences you couldn't predict. Yet as winter held the mountains tight, and Milo fought for each new day, James clung to one hope above all, that trust, once earned, could lead both man and wild back from the edge. Milo's recovery was a slow, uncertain journey, one marked by small victories and troubling setbacks that gnawed at James with every passing day. The tiny bobcat fought through the infection, his appetite gradually returning, but the consequences of his rescue began to reveal themselves in unexpected ways. Every morning James arrived at the Wildlife Rehab Center. Milo would perk up at the sound of his voice, inch closer to the side of his enclosure, and sometimes even press his nose to the glass, chirping for attention. The staff, at first heartened by his progress, soon grew uneasy. "See that?" one rehab tech said, her voice low as James watched from outside Milo's pen. "He's starting to treat people like family. That's not a good sign." Dr. Hayes echoed the concern during her rounds, noting how Milo seemed more interested in his human caretakers than in the natural behaviors expected of a wild bobcat. "He's imprinting on you, James. It's not your fault, but it means reintroduction's going to be harder than we hoped." They tried everything. Staff wore scent masking suits, kept handling to a minimum, introduced wild prey for him to hunt. But Milo, growing stronger every day, still looked for James, responded to his voice and lingered near the glass, tail flicking in anticipation. The hope that he would one day return to the wild began to fade, replaced by a dull ache of uncertainty. The mother bobcat, meanwhile, continued her vigil near James's cabin, seen occasionally on trail cameras pacing the tree line, returning again and again to the place where her kitten had vanished. The DNA test results arrived in the midst of this uncertainty, setting off a fresh wave of debate and tension. Milo, it turned out, was genetically unique, a rare carrier of traits that could prove vital for the health of the region's bobcat population. "He's special," Dr. Hayes explained, sliding the paperwork across the table toward James. "There's a strong case for keeping him safe. Maybe even starting a breeding program if he can't be reintroduced." James's heart twisted. He'd never wanted Milo to become a symbol, a specimen, or a tool. He'd wanted only to give him a chance at life. Now the stakes had grown, and the choices narrowed, each one complicated by science, policy, and the unpredictable rhythm of public opinion. Online, the backlash was building. An animal rights group posted a viral video calling James the kidnapper of the Blue Ridge, showing a montage of Milo behind glass, with somber music and captions like, "Should wild creatures live in cages?" The center's website was bombarded with angry messages and threats, while others rallied in support, donating money and sending letters praising the compassion of everyone involved. The debate wasn't just scientific now. It was personal, political, relentless. James spent long nights at the cabin, reading comments on his phone, unable to sleep. Some accused him of vanity, of wanting to play hero. Others insisted he should fight for Milo's freedom at any cost. A few offered gratitude, sharing stories of animals they'd rescued and lost, or saved against all odds. Each word cut deep, stirring up memories of the hospital, where every decision had felt just as fraught, just as public. Back then, he'd learned to live with second-guessing. Out here, alone in the mountains, the weight was heavier, because now the one who bore the consequences couldn't speak for himself, desperate for a solution that could honor both Milo's needs and the wild he'd come from. James started digging into state wildlife laws and rescue protocols. He discovered a little-known, complicated process called wild foster care, a last-resort program for animals too imprinted to be released, but too valuable to simply house in a zoo. It required specialized permits, ongoing monitoring, and a willingness to create a naturalistic, enriched habitat as close to the wild as possible. The application process was daunting, full of paperwork and home inspections, references, and ethical reviews. But for Milo, James decided, he'd jump through every hoop. He spent days gathering letters from biologists, neighbors, and even school teachers who'd heard about the story. He sketched plans for an outdoor enclosure, one big enough for Milo to climb, hunt, and hide, a place that might bridge the worlds between captivity and freedom. At the same time, he pressed the rehab center for more supervised visits between Milo and his mother, hoping that some bond could still be rekindled. The first attempt at a reunion was heartbreaking. Milo was placed in a secure outdoor pen with his mother nearby, separated by mesh fencing. The adult bobcat circled, ears flat, her body tense and wary. Milo, fearless, approached the barrier, chirping and pawing at the mesh, showing none of the shyness or caution of a wild animal. The mother hissed and swiped, clearly agitated. She didn't attack, but she also didn't call him to follow or show any recognition beyond a wild animal's instinctive mistrust. Afterward, the staff debated whether to keep trying or to focus on Milo's long-term care. "He's too used to people," one tech said, shaking her head. "His wildness is fading." James listened in silence, fighting the urge to defend himself, knowing there was no easy answer. The more James tried to find a perfect solution, the more he realized there might not be one. In saving Milo, he'd changed him forever, had accepted a responsibility that came with no manual, no guarantees, and no clean endings. But he also saw something powerful in the story that was unfolding. A testament to the messiness of compassion, the complexity of trust, and the price we pay when we try to do good in a world that doesn't offer easy forgiveness. One night, as a cold wind rattled the cabin, James sat at his kitchen table, filling out the final foster care forms. He looked up and saw the mother bobcat on the edge of the woods, her shape dark and strong against the moonlit snow. For a moment, he imagined she understood, that even across the gulf between their worlds, she recognized his promise. He would keep fighting for Milo. Not because it was simple, but because sometimes the only way to honor the wild is to do everything you can, even if it means living with the questions and carrying the burden forever. The slow thaw of spring crept over the Blue Ridge, washing the mountain ridges in soft green and gentle sun. By the time the wild foster care permit came through, the snow was only a memory, but the scars of winter still haunted James and Milo. Building the enclosure wasn't just a project. It became a mission. With the help of local supporters, volunteers, and even a few curious schoolchildren, James transformed a patch of his land into something between sanctuary and wilderness. Tall climbing logs, shaded dens, rocks and shrubs, a running stream, all surrounded by a fence high and strong enough to keep Milo safe, yet invisible enough to let the woods feel close. The process was exhausting, filled with setbacks and small triumphs. Sometimes James would catch himself laughing with the volunteers as they struggled to drag a boulder into place, or sweating under the sun, and realize how strange it felt to be part of a community again, after so long spent on the margins. Each night, when the tools were put away and the forest hummed with frogs and crickets, James walked the perimeter, looking for signs of the mother bobcat. She returned always, leaving her mark, a scrape in the dirt, a twist of fur, the sharp scent of wildness that reminded James this project was as much for her as for her son. When the enclosure was finally finished, Milo moved in under the watchful eye of Dr. Hayes and a small army of biologists, naturalists, and local kids who'd heard his story. At first, the kitten seemed overwhelmed. He crouched low, ears swiveling, unsure of the space and the sky above him. But it didn't take long for wild instinct to reassert itself. Within days, Milo was exploring every corner, testing his claws on bark, learning to leap from boulder to boulder. He stalked bugs and watched the birds from the shadows. The humans monitored quietly, careful to limit their interactions. But it was clear Milo's old bond with James still lingered. Sometimes he'd appear near the fence at dawn, watching the house as if remembering the warmth of the cabin and the voice that had carried him through the worst of the storm. The mother bobcat's presence became a phenomenon all its own. On some mornings, James would spot her prowling around the enclosure's edge, scent-marking trees and rocks with a slow, deliberate patience. The biologists set up motion-activated cameras and collected data, fascinated by the persistence of the maternal connection. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Hayes said one afternoon, scanning the footage of mother and son pacing the fence on opposite sides. She hasn't forgotten him, but she doesn't know how to reach him now that he's neither wild nor captive. Word of Milo's story spread beyond the mountains. School groups came for educational tours, lining up along the observation blind while James or one of the scientists explained the delicate balance of rescue, rehabilitation, and the sometimes blurry line between help and harm. Milo became a symbol, a lesson about compassion and the tangled consequences of human intervention. Some students scribbled notes. Others just stood silent, wide-eyed, as the bobcat crept through the tall grass or rolled in the sun, at once fierce and fragile. The local news ran a segment titled, "A Family Divided, the Bobcats of Blue Ridge," showing slow-motion clips of Milo and his mother lying on opposite sides of the mesh, noses nearly touching. The segment sparked a new wave of attention. Activists, scientists, and state wildlife officials began to debate Milo's future in earnest. Should he remain here, a bridge between species, or should they risk a last attempt at rewilding, even if it might mean losing him altogether? For James, the answer was never simple. He met with officials, answered endless questions, and fought quietly for what felt right. If we force him back, he argued, we're not honoring the trust he's given us. But if we keep him caged, we risk turning him into something that's neither wild nor truly free. The dilemma twisted inside him, echoes of every hard choice he'd made in the ER, every patient whose fate balanced on a needle's edge. One night, months after Milo's arrival in the enclosure, James woke to the sound of rustling leaves outside his window. He crept to the observation blind, heart pounding. In the moonlit grass, Milo and his mother lay side by side, separated by only the wire fence, their bodies pressed as close as they could get, breathing in time, eyes closed. James felt a lump in his throat, a mixture of joy and sorrow that defied words. He knew then that the wild could not be mended, only honored. The next morning, state wildlife officials announced a new initiative. They would use Milo's case as a pilot for a more compassionate, case-by-case approach to intervention. No more rigid rules. Instead, a recognition that the world was messier, the wild more complex, than any regulation could capture. The decision felt like a small victory, proof that even in the midst of pain and ambiguity, change was possible. As summer deepened, the rhythms of the sanctuary grew richer. Scientists came and went, tracking Milo's progress, taking notes on the mother's visits. Schoolchildren planted wildflowers around the enclosure, leaving behind painted stones and letters addressed to Milo, the bravest cat. James often walked the paths alone at dusk, feeling the heartbeat of the woods all around him. He knew that nothing would ever be the same. He also knew he wouldn't have chosen differently. What began as a desperate act of mercy had become something larger, a lesson, a community, and a living testament to the stubbornness of trust, even when the world splits it down the middle. The wild, James realized, wasn't just outside the fence. It lived in every risk, every hope, every hard decision we make for those who can't speak for themselves. And sometimes, the bravest thing you could do was to simply stand watch, honoring the thin, shimmering line between loss and love. Spring crept into full bloom, painting the mountains in a tapestry of green and wildflowers, and with the warmer days came a sense of cautious hope in James's heart. Milo had grown strong. His gait, once tentative on a healing paw, was now bold and confident as he prowled his large enclosure, stalking leaves and dragonflies, chasing the long shadows that danced beneath the trees. The enclosure, so carefully designed to echo the wild, was now fully alive, a miniature forest where Milo leapt and climbed, reclaiming a piece of his wild birthright with every passing day. But even as life inside the fence flourished, the space beyond the wire, those deep woods, endless and mysterious, still called to something restless in both James and Milo. The mother bobcat's visits grew less frequent as the spring stretched on. Sometimes days would pass without a single sign. Then, just as James would start to worry she had given up or moved on, he'd catch a glimpse of her tawny shape at dawn or dusk, lingering at the very edge of sight, silent and watchful. James had started opening the sanctuary to local schools and small groups, inviting people to learn, not just about Milo, but about the delicate, difficult balance of intervention and respect for the wild. He spoke with a quiet passion, often standing in the dappled shade with a cluster of children at his side. "You see, trust is a fragile thing," he'd say, gesturing toward Milo. "It's not perfect, and sometimes it's not forever. But it matters. Every act of care, every choice to help or step back, changes something, in them and in us." The children watched Milo with wide eyes, sometimes giggling as he pounced on a falling blossom or stretched languidly in the sunlight. James encouraged their questions. "Will Milo ever go back to the wild?" one boy asked, earnest and uncertain. James knelt beside him, thinking before he answered. "That's the hardest part," he admitted. "We're still trying to figure out where he belongs. He's not like a pet, but he's not quite wild anymore either. All we can do is give him respect and room to be himself, and keep the door open, just in case." Trail cameras captured tender, bittersweet moments. Some nights, mother and son still found each other through the mesh, Milo chirping softly at the fence, his mother responding with a low, rumbling purr that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. Other nights, the mother would simply pass by, silent, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. Their relationship had changed, but a thread still connected them, something beyond language, beyond the boundaries humans tried to draw. James sometimes stood at the edge of the enclosure, hands in his pockets, watching the reunion play out as the sun set behind the ridges. He marveled at the resilience of both animals. Milo, adapting and surviving in a world remade by accident and kindness. The mother, carrying her hope through a long winter and into an uncertain spring. James realized their story was not just about what he'd done or failed to do. It was about how two wild hearts could keep finding each other, again and again, in a world divided by fences and fears. The Wildlife Center organized a public education day, inviting local families, scientists, and policymakers. James found himself standing at the center of attention, both nervous and proud, as he shared the story. How trust had begun at the edge of the woods, how it had survived storms, loss, and doubt, and how it continued, imperfect but persistent, every day. "What you see here," he told the crowd, "isn't a perfect ending. It's an ongoing promise. We didn't fix everything, but we honored what was entrusted to us as best we could." One scientist pointed out, "There's something remarkable here. We're learning in real time, not just about bobcats, but about ourselves, about how the lines we draw between wild and tame, help and harm, are never as clear as we want." James nodded, feeling the truth settle deep. He could see it in Milo's eyes, in the cautious way he sometimes regarded strangers, in the wild hope that flared whenever his mother appeared. "It's real," he repeated softly to a young girl nearby. "It's not perfect, but it's real." The season's turning brought a quiet, hopeful signal. Milo continued to thrive. Not wild, not tame, but always respected, always watched over. And though the mother visited less often, James still found her tracks in the morning dew, circling the enclosure, pausing at the gate before melting away into the trees. Sometimes James woke at dawn, drinking his coffee by the window, feeling the weight of the journey in his bones. The doubts still surfaced. Had he done too much or not enough? Would Milo ever be truly free? But then, as sunlight gilded the leaves, he'd catch sight of Milo climbing high, muscles rippling, eyes fixed on the horizon. He realized then that hope could thrive even within boundaries, that love could echo through wire and wood and open sky. That afternoon, as the last visitors left, James lingered by the enclosure, watching Milo nap in a patch of sunlight. He spoke softly, as if the bobcat might understand. "We did our best, little guy. That's all anyone can do." He thought of the promise he'd made that night in the storm, to never give up, to honor the trust placed in him, however imperfectly. And in the quiet, with the forest stretching wide and wild around him, James found a kind of peace, not in closure but in the fragile, enduring thread of trust that wove together his life, Milo's, and the wild world they both still belonged to. The mountain air grew warmer as summer settled over the Blue Ridge, and with it came invitations James never expected. One day, a letter arrived on official letterhead. The National Wildlife Symposium wanted him to share Milo's story. James hesitated for days before agreeing. Public speaking had never been his strength. He was more comfortable behind a camera or lost in the woods than under bright lights. But something about the request resonated. Maybe, after all the criticism and confusion, it was time to say aloud what this journey had truly cost and taught him. At the conference, the room was filled with scientists, activists, students, and policymakers. James stood at the podium, hands trembling, and glanced at the faces before him, some skeptical, some sympathetic, some simply curious. He cleared his throat and began, voice raw but steady. "I'm not an expert in wildlife policy. I'm just a man who tried to do what seemed right on a cold night in the mountains. But I've learned a few things I'd like to share." He told the story honestly, not shying away from the missteps and doubts. He described that first encounter with the starving bobcat, the impossible choice to intervene, the days spent fighting for Milo's life, and the aftermath, the debates, the anger, the lessons learned in the quiet aftermath of action. As he spoke, the images played in his mind. The mother's unwavering vigil, Milo's eyes searching for comfort, the bitter cold, and the first tender signs of trust. "Compassion," James said, "sometimes brings unintended change. You don't always get to choose the consequences of your actions, no matter how good your intentions. You can try to do right by a single life, but the wild isn't a puzzle you can fix. Every time we step in, we leave a mark, on the animal, on the land, and on ourselves." The room was silent. James continued, finding strength in the truth of his experience. "I wish I could tell you there's a perfect answer, some formula that lets us help without risk. But there isn't. The wild's trust is a precious, heavy responsibility. When a creature allows you into its world, even for a moment, you are changed too. You can't pretend you were never there. You have to carry that with humility." He spoke of the early mornings watching Milo and his mother at the fence, of the bittersweet comfort in seeing their bond endure, even when nature and circumstance had divided them. "I learned that loving the wild means accepting imperfection. You save what you can, and you honor what you cannot change. Sometimes, all you can do is keep the promise to try, and forgive yourself when the outcome isn't what you dreamed." During the Quanda, an older conservationist asked, "Do you regret it? Would you do the same if you could start again?" James paused, considering. "Regret? I have plenty. Things I wish I'd done differently, things I wish I could have foreseen. But if the choice is between acting with compassion and turning away, I'd still choose to care. Not because it's easy, but because it's the only way I know to honor what matters. We can't always return what we take from the wild, but we can carry humility and learn from our mistakes. Later, a young wildlife biologist approached James in the hallway. "Your story changed the way I think about intervention," she said. "We always talk about doing no harm, but sometimes harm and help come tangled together. Maybe what matters is how we live with that." James smiled, feeling both understood and humbled. The message was spreading, not just the story of a man and a bobcat, but the realization that every act of care leaves ripples, both beautiful and unpredictable. Over the following weeks, James received letters and emails from people who'd once criticized him. Some had changed their minds, seeing nuance where before they'd seen only black and white. "Thank you for showing us the cost of caring," one message read. "Your honesty helped us understand there's no easy answer." Even a few state officials reached out, asking for his input on a new set of wildlife guidelines, policies that valued not just scientific protocol, but also lived experience and compassion. Back in the mountains, James reflected on all that had unfolded. He realized that the real lesson of Milo's story wasn't about a single animal or a single act of rescue, but about the web of responsibility that connects every living thing. Every time we reach across that border between human and wild, between help and harm, we become part of something bigger and riskier than ourselves. Some nights, sitting outside the enclosure as fireflies flickered in the dusk, James spoke softly to the bobcat mother, wherever she might be listening. "We did our best," he'd say, voice gentle, "and we learned. I hope that's enough." He watched Milo nap beneath the stars, peaceful and dignified, neither captive nor truly wild, a living symbol of imperfection, survival, and trust. The pain of not having a perfect ending was still there, but it was balanced by a sense of gratitude for having tried. To love the wild, James understood at last, was to accept that you cannot control its fate. You can only show up, do your part, and honor what is entrusted to you, no matter how uncertain the outcome. As the mountain night deepened, James felt a rare and quiet fulfillment. Not the satisfaction of victory, but the peace of knowing he had chosen to care, and that, in the end, was enough. Dawn in the Blue Ridge brought a stillness so complete it felt sacred. Wisps of fog drifted between the trees. The forest floor dappled with golden light as the sun rose behind the hills. In the hush before the day truly began, Milo lounged atop a sun-warmed boulder in his habitat, his fur glowing and his eyes half-closed, the picture of wild dignity. The world around him was quiet except for birdsong and the distant rush of a creek. It was a peace that James had rarely known, a peace that asked nothing but presence, humility, and gratitude. A fresh set of tracks circled the enclosure's edge that morning, broad, sure, unmistakably those of the mother bobcat. James followed their winding trail with his eyes as he sipped his coffee, watching as they disappeared into the shadows where the forest thickened and secrets lingered. He wondered, as he always did, what the mother felt in those moments. Did she mourn what was lost, or accept what was given? Did she understand, on some wild level, the bargain that had been made for her son? James no longer searched for neat answers. Over months and seasons, he'd come to realize that fulfillment, true abiding fulfillment, did not come from victory or from tying up every loose end. It came from honoring trust, from holding close the fragile line between help and harm, and from accepting the limits of what any one person could do. He walked the sanctuary's border, hands deep in his pockets, breathing in the scent of pine and damp earth. Milo rolled lazily onto his back in the sunlight, swatting at a butterfly, the picture of innocence and strength. He had grown into a magnificent creature, not a house cat, not a captive, not fully wild. He was something in between, a living testament to the tangled gifts of compassion and the cost of intervention. His eyes remained bright, curious, and unafraid. James thought often about that word, trust. It was the one thing that had mattered most through every trial and every sleepless night. Trust had been offered at the edge of the woods in the form of a starving mother's gaze. It had been tested in the blizzard and in the long vigil beside a wounded kitten. It had survived scrutiny, doubt, backlash, and hope. In the end, trust was not something James had claimed. It was something he had been given, and it was something he would spend his whole life striving to honor. He knelt down outside the fence, close enough that Milo lifted his head, ears pricking in recognition. "Hey, buddy," James said softly. "Look at you." He let himself smile, seeing the muscle and confidence in Milo's movements, the self-assurance of an animal who belonged to himself and to the wild, if not to either world completely. "You're doing all right, aren't you?" Nearby, the last traces of the mother's footprints glimmered in the dew. James touched one with his hand, feeling the delicate impression in the soft earth, and bowed his head. "Thank you," he whispered, not sure if the words were for the bobcat, the mountains, or for something larger and nameless that watched over all wild things. That afternoon, James welcomed a small group of children and their teacher to the sanctuary for one last educational session before summer break. He stood beneath the towering pines and told Milo's story, not as a tale of simple rescue, but as a lesson in humility and responsibility. "The wild isn't here to be saved by us," he explained, his voice gentle but firm. "It's here to be respected. Sometimes loving the wild means knowing when to let go, and sometimes it means standing by through the unknown. What matters most is that when trust finds you, you answer gently, with care that echoes long after the moment is gone." He invited the children to walk the perimeter, to look for tracks and signs of the bobcats, to listen for the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Their questions came fast and eager. "Will Milo ever leave? Does his mom still visit? Are you sad?" James answered honestly. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, sometimes he just didn't know. And that was okay. As evening fell and the group departed, James lingered by the fence, watching as the sky turned indigo and the first stars appeared. Milo paced along the border, sniffing where his mother's scent lingered, pausing to gaze into the trees. It struck James that some stories did not end with triumph or tragedy, but with a kind of acceptance, a willingness to carry the questions and live with the consequences, whatever they might be. James took comfort in the thought that, for all its uncertainties, trust could outlast borders, could bridge the distance between wild and human, between past and future. In the end, it was trust that brought people together, that inspired compassion and action, that bound every living thing in a web of hope and possibility. With that in mind, James offered his final words to those who might listen, whether in person or in spirit. If this story touched you, remember, every act of care is both a gift and a responsibility. Share these lessons. In a world full of lines and borders, it's trust, not control, that brings us together. He watched Milo disappear into the dusk, strong and sure, and knew that their story would live on, not in the pages of a book or the frame of a photograph, but in every heart willing to answer the call of trust, and in every act of gentle, imperfect care for the wild. And as night closed gently over the blue ridge, James finally felt at peace, Not because everything had been fixed, but because everything had been honored.